Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to yet another interesting, distinguished lecture in the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations on India's evasive balancing in the Indo-Pacific, a realist perspective by Professor Rajesh Rajagopalan. He's not new to the department. He once had delivered a orientation lecture for the students of Department of Geopolitics and International Relations. He had come down to Manipal. We have had interactions with him. Everybody knows his scholarship. Yet, for the benefit of all those students who are here, I would like to introduce him. And it's very apt in a semester where the demand is actually from the student side. In fact, many of our students read this through, and I'm also told that there was an elaborate discussion among their own group in a different social media level they wanted to. So we thought, why not listen from the person who has coined it, who has authored it, and it was apt, and that's how this idea came in. And when I requested, Professor Rajesh readily agreed to deliver this one, though he's been busy in almost 3 to 4 days in a week in teaching itself, but yet he agreed to deliver this particular lecture. So I'll take pleasure in introducing him to the August gathering here. Professor Rajesh Rajagopalan is at the International Politics Center for International Politics at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. His publications include 3 books: Nuclear South Asia, Keywords and Concepts, co-authored with Atul Mishra, that is published by Routledge in 2014. Fighting Like a Guerrilla, the Indian Army and the Counterinsurgency, again by the Routledge in 2008. Second Strike, Arguments about Nuclear War in South Asia, published by Penguin in 2005. His articles, which are also jointly authored, have appeared in a number of academic and policy journals such as International Affairs, the Washington Quarterly, Contemporary Security Policy, India Review, Contemporary South Asia, Small Wars and Insurgencies, South Asia, South Asian Survey and Strategic Analysis, as well as in many other places, including Indian press and other media, including the print, the Economic Times, the Hindu, Indian Express, Financial Express, and Hindustan Times. I'm sure that's nowhere enough to introduce a scholar of his stature, but yet listen more from him on the subject that we are talking about. I thought it's very, very interesting to look at what he talks about. Apparently, he defines it as an important concept to look at as a response to an overwhelming threat that needs to be balanced amid uncertainty about the feasibility of such balancing and fear about the consequences should such balancing efforts be ineffective. Where he talks about evasive balance as a concept in his recent article that came in January 2020. Professor Rajesh Rajagopalan, we are extremely happy to have you here on behalf of the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations and Manipal Academy of Higher Education. I heartily welcome you to deliver this lecture. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Kishore, and thanks also to all the faculty and students of the Department of Geopolitics and IR at Mahe. I have been there, as Ankush said, a few years back. But I'm very pleased to again sort of meet all of you and talk to you. This is a paper that as Kishore mentioned, and I'm quite surprised and pleased that so many of you have read the paper. So I wanted to sort of I was uh, looking at India's strategy towards Indo-Pacific, which of course is essentially about India. Essentially about China and how India balances against China and the viability of India's strategy towards China. So to sort of give a brief overview of how I came to write this. As an IR scholar, one of the things that has sort of worried me is that we have always sort of underbalanced against China. And so I was keen to understand why it is that India has repeatedly underbalancing, of course, the concept. Also, Randall Schweller is well known for developing that concept of underbalancing So it is sort of I explored that in elsewhere in another sort of paper that I wrote for an ISA conference on how on so the logic of underbalancing. But that is not entirely satisfactory to me. So I wanted to examine India's current policy and what it might mean, why this policy might not work, or how this policy might work. One of the puzzling things about a lot of responses to the rise of China, and it is not just India, of course. It's also other countries in Asia. So this applies not just to India; it also applies to other countries in Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia. Um, is to look at how they have sort of attempted to deal with this sort of change in the condition, structural condition of the balance of power in the region, because China's rise clearly has changed that balance of power. So, but the problem is also that we have had some difficulty, and there's a long debate over the last 2 decades. From the 2000s onwards, we've had a long debate about whether Asian countries are balancing against China or they're not balancing against China. You have beginning with Aaron Friedberg in the early 1990s, after the end of the Cold War. Aaron Friedberg wrote a piece suggesting that the rise of China will lead to greater conflict in Asia. Subsequently, John Mearsheimer, in his very famous book, even though the book was not about China per se, but he does suggest that in that book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, that China's rise will represent a significant problem and that will lead to greater conflict in Asia. But on the other hand, you had also a lot of Asian scholars who have argued that Asian international relations, Asian international politics is different. That just because you have balancing strategies and balancing happening in from the European context, realism coming essentially from the European context, um, but that doesn't necessarily happen. Doesn't have to happen in Asia. The Asian IR is different, and therefore you are unlikely to have balancing take place in Asia. And if you look through the last 2 decades, we also see a very peculiar situation, peculiar not in the historical sense, because in the pre-Second World War period, this would not be peculiar, but especially during the Cold War, what we had was not just a Cold War, a bipolar competition, but you also had a situation where there was hardly any interaction, any trade or cultural or diplomatic interaction. A diplomatic interaction, not in a sort of not other than enmity between the two polar powers, between the United States and the Soviet Union. So that Cold War experience to some extent was different because historically speaking, great powers, even when they were competing, they have had a great level of economic interaction. Also, maybe not through periods of war, but prior to periods of war. The best example, of course, is the pre-First World War period when there was very, very high levels of economic interdependence between all the great powers in Europe. But nevertheless, you did have that system ending up in a in a sorry, was that a question or something? Sorry. Okay. In a conflict. So and so what you have today is with China's rise is that a peculiar situation where you have a lot of concern about China, but you also have a lot of interaction, economic interaction and interdependence with China. So how do you, so are countries in the region, are they balancing against China, or are they hedging against China, or is balancing inappropriate to use as a concept in understanding international politics in Asia? So Asian IR scholars like Amitav Acharya or David Kang and so on would argue that Asia is different, and therefore you are not likely to see the kind of situation that we had in Europe historically, where there was a lot of great powers, and those great powers were constantly playing balance of power politics against each other, and they used as evidence. Steve Chan also used as evidence the fact that there was so much economic interdependence between China and all of its neighbors and Southeast Asia, East Asia, including with India, and the fact that there was not a high level of military spending, military budgets. If you look at military budgets in the region, both China's as well as in the neighborhood, they haven't really dramatically gone up. And so, military spending is not the only indicator, of course, of balancing, but it is one indicator of balancing. If you are balancing, then your the levels, the amount of money you're spending on defense is likely to go up. So, how do we sort of understand this condition where you have concern about China, but you also have a lot of economic interaction with China, but also not a high level of military spending? And to add to that complication, you also have, in addition to these existing complications, you also have the fact that the United States has close relationships, security relationship with many of the countries in East Asia, and a growing security relationship with India. You have the Quad, which all suggests balancing, but then the Quad never actually mentions China. So it's a very complex situation. How do we understand that? So part of the argument from scholars has been this concept called hedging, and they argued that Evelyn Goh is prominent. She's one of the first person to talk about hedging as a strategy. So hedging is what this pattern of behavior was described as. That states where both engaging with China, but also trying to balance China. So that interaction was characterized as hedging, and it's a very common characteristics. Whereas a very common definition, very common concept that is used to describe how a lot of countries in Asia are dealing with China. On the other hand, you also have, of course, a lot of other scholars who are arguing that it's not hedging because many of these countries are actually balancing uh, uh, against China. So in a sense, that is a complication, and India is part of that complication because India's efforts also, even after Galwan, but I'll come to that. But definitely before Galwan, after Doklam and so on, our policy has been some level of increased balancing, but also a significant level of a significant effort to talk to China, to sort of pacify and reassure China, and so on and so forth. So how do we understand that? So in trying to understand that is how I sort of try to sort of look at conceptually from theory point of view how to understand Indian behavior, but also that I think, as I said, applies also to Southeast Asian countries. And my sense has been that this effort is sort of a foot in both parts of it, an effort both to balance China as well as to reassure China is unlikely to work. So that is a sort of my basic conclusion is that balancing and reassurance. Reassurance is another IR theoretical concept, so I'll come to that. But what we are seeing is not so much hedging as much as an effort at both balancing and reassuring China. And I would argue that this is the worst of all possible worlds, and therefore these countries are not likely to succeed. And that's why I call it unviable as a strategy. That's what I characterize as evasive balancing. Because there are lots of other kinds of balancing concepts, I mean, covert balancing and things like that. And I was not happy with the existing sort of concepts that were being used, variants of balancing, which is why I sort of came up with this notion of evasive balancing. So to briefly go back, I want to begin by summarizing what India's policy towards Southeast Asia has been, the Indo-Pacific has been. So there's a lot of excellent work. I don't have anything new there to add because basically what we've had is since the early 1990s, we had a look east policy, and then that look east policy evolved into what is called act east policy, and that now is evolved into the Indo-Pacific strategy. Right? I mean, so but the original look east policy, as all of you know, is was an effort to slipstream behind ASEAN's dynamic economic growth. So ASEAN was growing very rapidly. India wanted to benefit from ASEAN, the growth in the ASEAN area. So Look East was an effort to build those links, build those trading links with ASEAN, the ASEAN region, in order to boost India's own economic growth. But then that did not go very far, as we all know, and that Act East was a way to provide a greater impetus to that Look East policy. But then both Look East and Act East were essentially focused on trade and essentially focused on using trade as a form of as an effort at improving India's own economic growth rates. But what we have with Indo-Pacific is a shift in that it is moving from economics to security. So whereas Look East and Act East were primarily, there was a security component to it also, but it was primarily an economic strategy, an economic policy, economic diplomacy. The Indo-Pacific strategy is more a security-oriented policy. We can sort of debate about what is meant by the Indo-Pacific, what is the definition of Indo-Pacific. From the Indian definition, at least, it is from the shores of Africa to that of the Americas, the east coast of Africa to the west coast of the United States. But that is why not gel with other countries who have different notions of what the Indo-Pacific, the region of Indo-Pacific is. But nevertheless, but the point is that that shift towards security hasn't really improved India's overall capacities, either on the security front or on the trade or economic integration front. So trade is still much lower than what it should be. I'm talking about the pre-pandemic period. The pandemic is yet another confusing circumstance that we'll have to wait and see how that will pan out. But as I said, strategic concerns now dominate India's strategy vis-a-vis Indo-Pacific. Three reasons, which I'm sure all of you are fairly familiar with. One is that a perception in Delhi that China is trying to encircle us, trying to encircle India because of its growing links with South Asian countries within India's neighborhood, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, and so on and so forth. The second is that India has an interest in the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea because much of India's trade flows through that. So we have Indo-Pacific as supporting a free and open Indo-Pacific and rules-based order, things like that. And the third reason is China itself is foraying into the Indian Ocean. China itself is sort of moving into the Indian Ocean, and India has been very concerned about that. So for all of those reasons, all of those strategic reasons sort of explain the change in India's policy, the shift from Act East to the Indo-Pacific strategy. But despite all of that, India's military capacity actually to sort of deal with that with the existing security concerns have actually not expanded, really speaking, but actually declined especially vis-a-vis China. In relative terms, clearly it has declined vis-a-vis China. So, as I said earlier, when we try to understand this policy, the shift towards Indo-Pacific and the utility of that, to get a little bit into the weeds of these concepts, balancing is what we characterize as behavior when states respond to external threats. This could be, of course, either by internal means or external means. So we call it internal balancing or external balancing. Internal balancing is, building your own military capability, building arms, buying arms, acquiring arms of some kind, to enhance your military capabilities. External balancing is what we do when we build allies, when we build relationships, security treaties, and so on and so forth. So that's broadly what balancing is. And there is lots of associated concepts with balancing that I'll come to in a minute. But broadly speaking, balancing is states responding to external threats, to external conditions. Hedging is, as a concept, hedging is where you have, as I said earlier, states that have both uh, balancing strategies, as it is used in especially in the last 20 years or so, last 10, 15 years, states that engage in both some form of balancing, but also some form of economic linkages. And the problem with this, that many scholars have found with defining hedging in this way, is that for one reason, all states at all times have some kind of economic uh, economic linkages, even when they're balanced, right? I mean, so if you take the concept of hedging and you say that hedging is whenever states use whenever states have both trade relations as well as engage in security balancing against threat, that has always been there. So then that means that hedging is very indiscriminate. I mean, so that as a concept, it is not useful because uh, even during the Cold War, even though I said earlier, Cold War was peculiar in that the two polar powers, the two great powers, did not have very much economic linkages. Uh, Unlike historically, that is peculiar. But even there, even with the United States and the Soviet Union, there was some trade links. I mean, it wasn't completely broken. It was very limited, but there was some trade. So the problem becomes of one of discrimination of what is hedging and what is normal trading linkages between states, even when they are in conflict, right? Because all states, even in conflict, have some level of trading. So it's never entirely devoid. Even states in conflict are not entirely devoid of those kinds of things. So that's one problem with hedging, because hedging doesn't tell us when this is normal trading relations and when this is security strategy. The other part is that, as some scholars have pointed out, is that states, nobody is really balancing. Hedging would suggest that states are taking a neutral position between the United States and China, the two sort of polar powers now. But what we don't really have that. I mean, because what we have is a situation where, to the extent that there is any balance, states are balancing against China. Right? They are not balancing against the United States. So if you look at much of Southeast Asia, East Asia, there is no balancing going on against the United States. I mean, leave out North Korea. No balancing going on against the United States. It's balancing against China, right? I mean, so it's not really hedging. If you look at it, especially if you remove, excise the economic part of it, what you have is essentially balancing, states balancing against China. Nobody's balancing against the United States. So it's not really midpoint between the United States and China, which is what you would expect from an actual hedging strategy. So hedging has problems. So hedging as a concept has problems in explaining what is going on vis-a-vis how states are responding, how East Asian states are responding to China. But if you take balancing, that also has its own problems, because if you you do have these sorts of trade linkages, and you do have some level of diplomatic efforts to convince China that they should be peaceful and so on and so forth. So even though some level of the argument that is made by people who favor defining this as balancing, defining the kind of behavior that we see in Asia vis-a-vis China as balancing, is that some of these economic linkages and diplomatic policies are not actually normal diplomatic or economic policies, right? Because they are explicitly designed to reduce animosity with China. For example, to give you only one example, after Doklam, not only did India have the informal summits in Wuhan and Chennai, but we also took a lot of other efforts to demonstrate to China that we are not adversarial. There was this episode where Tibetan exiles were celebrating. I'm forgetting exactly now what. I think it was um, one of the anniversaries of Tibet, and there was an explicit order from the MEA saying no government official should go to that those ceremonies, and there were think tanks that were planning conferences which were seen as anti-China, and therefore the MEA sent out word saying that no, you should not hold these conferences. And so there were a number of things that India did even after the Doklam crisis to try to convince China that India was not balancing against China. And of course, there was also, even though the Quad initiative had taken place, we tried to slow down the Quad. I mean, we kind of went a bit cold on the Quad. And if you recall, in the early first couple of years, we did not even refer to the Quad. I mean, if you go back and look at the MEA statements about these meetings, we would refer to it very cumbersomely as the India, US, Australia, Japan dialogue. And, so we didn't even use the word Quad. Even when a question was asked of MEA spokespeople as to what was the Quad doing, or what when is the next Quad meeting, they would not use the word Quad themselves. They would sort of reply using this very cumbersome language. And then there was a BRICS summit and all these other linkages that we had with China. So there was all of that was clearly a security strategy in the sense that we are trying to reduce the threat perception that we had vis-a-vis China by trying to convince China that we're not adversarial. So considering that these were security policies, you can't entirely remove it from the overall from the menu of what we were doing, when the menu of the choices that we were making. So, but the balancing theorist argument was that these are all normal diplomatic intercourse, and therefore we should not include that. We have to remove that when you look at policies. So unfortunately, that doesn't work, because this was an explicitly security-oriented policies, and therefore we can't sort of entirely remove them. And so, in that respect, balancing also as a concept was insufficient. So you have a situation where hedging as a concept is insufficient, and then the other alternative was balancing, and balancing the traditional way, traditional definition of balancing was also insufficient. Then there were other concepts like covert balancing, but that doesn't, or asymmetric balancing, things like that. And again, when I'm talking about balancing here, I'm not talking about balancing. Balancing, there are two ways of understanding balance. Balancing is, on the one hand, it's an outcome. We achieve a balance of power. But when I'm talking about balancing here, when I'm talking about balance of power, I'm talking about balancing as behavior. Like balancing is also a description of a kind of state behavior, and that's what I'm talking about. So balancing as behavior. So when you talk about that, there are a number of different balancing concepts, like covert balancing, asymmetric balancing, things like that. But none of them also fully, none of them specifically are designed to explain this kind of a mixture of. Definitely, one aspect of it is balancing. There's a mixture of balancing plus this kind of other efforts to reassure the threat, reassure the target itself that you're not trying to balance. So that complication is what I was trying to explain. And so the only explanation that I could find of this kind of strategy was what comes from scholars like Charles Glaser, which is basically reassurance as a concept. So Charles Glaser and others who talk about reassurance argue that in an anarchical international system, since the primary problem is insecurity as a consequence of uncertainty, because in an anarchical order, you don't know what other states are. There is an information asymmetry in the sense that you don't know what others are doing. You can see what others are doing, but you don't know why they're doing what they're doing. So if you see your neighbor building weapons, you don't know why they're building weapons. Are they building weapons because they want to attack you, or are they building weapons because their military wants, you know, newer tools, or is it because you now have more money and therefore you're going to splurge on weapons? So, what is the purpose for which you are buying weapons or building weapons? Right? I mean, so there is that uncertainty, and uncertainty leads to suspicion. So you don't know why they're doing what they're doing. So in order to be safe, you would rather assume the worst. So you would therefore becomes the security dilemma, that because your neighbor is doing that, you respond. Pakistan builds weapons, therefore you build weapons to respond, and then Pakistan gets insecure, and that's the John Verse's notion of the security dilemma. That it becomes a vicious cycle where you can't break out. And what Charles Glaser was suggesting was that, so if uncertainty is the problem, what you can do is try to convince the other side that you don't mean them any harm, that you are not trying to harm them, and if therefore you can break that security, the security dilemma. So you can try to convince them that you mean them no harm, to reassure them. The problem is that reassurance is risky, obviously, because it makes you vulnerable. Because if you try to reassure your enemies by, let us say, not buying or building weapons that make them particularly insecure, then that could make you vulnerable, right? I mean, so if you say, I'm going to try to reassure my neighbor, and therefore I will pull all my military away from the border, that of course may reassure them, but it may also incentivize them to attack you, right? So that is the problem that states face, which is that if you try to reassure your adversary, that could potentially make you vulnerable, and therefore states don't engage in it. And so one of the problems with Charles Placer's uh, concept of reassurance is that he himself admits that it's difficult to find historical examples of reassurance, especially reassurance strategies that have actually worked, because the alternative to making yourself vulnerable is that you can try to convince your adversary through, you can try to tell them that you don't mean them any harm. But then the problem, as Glaser himself points out, is that for reassurance strategies to be meaningful, uh, you have to make some sacrifice, right? Otherwise, it's meaningless words. I mean, you're simply saying that, oh, I'm not aggressive, I'm not, I don't mean you any harm. Nobody's going to be convinced. They're going to look at your actions. So you have to be able to take meaningful actions. Meaningful actions meaning, something that is significant, that will make you vulnerable. That is the only way to convince the other side that you sincerely do not mean them any harm. Right? In the old history of the Peloponnesian War, and throughout medieval and ancient history, we've had cases where one of the terms of, let's say, a peace treaty would be, as it was in the case of Athens and Sparta at the end of the Peloponnesian War, you have to pull down your walls, because walls make you invulnerable, and therefore you could be up to no good, right? And therefore, to convince me that you are not up to any you don't have any bad intentions, you have to remove your defenses. You break your walls, you break your defenses. But that happened in the case of Athens after the end of the Peloponnesian War and after the loss of the Peloponnesian, right? I mean, so it's not so a country that is lost might engage in that kind of behavior because they're forced to do that. But countries would not end up doing that. But this is a dilemma. So for it to be meaningful, you have to take steps that will make you vulnerable. But making yourself alternatively, you can simply try meaningless words, that won't work. But making yourself vulnerable is something that states would not necessarily do. And so reassurance as a strategy has a lot of internal problems as well as empirical problems, because we don't have histories of states engaging in that kind of reassurance strategy. So what I do with evasive balancing is combine both of these, that is balancing and reassurance. So what India is trying to do and what other countries are trying to do is attempt to do both balancing and reassurance, because reassurance is also security strategy, right? So evasive balancing is a combination of balancing and reassurance. So you're on the one hand, you're balancing, but on the other hand, you're also trying to reassure China that you don't mean them any harm. Right? You don't mean them any harm. But of course, the problem is that China looks at what you're doing, not what you're saying. And so, as any country would. And so, they are going to respond to what you're doing rather than what you're saying. Right? And so, that's the reason why I would sort of argue that this is unviable. So, if you look at India's specific strategy, you find components of both balancing and reassurance. Internal balancing is not that important, obviously, because internal balancing is something that all of you know enough about what India has been doing. But even the last couple of weeks, we've had a big debate about theater command and whether the Air Force would be under the army and things like that, with General Rawat and other Air Force chief publicly feuding about theater command. But leaving aside the feuding about theater command, what does that represent? What that represents is that we are rejigging our military forces, reorganizing our military forces in order to better deal with the threat from China. Right? And so we have been doing that for some time. At least 10 years back now, we've been talking about building a strike corps vis-a-vis China. We have strike corps against Pakistan, but we don't have a strike corps against China. And over the last decade, we have shifted a significant chunk of the army, or we are shifting some parts of the army away from the Pakistan border, from the LOC to the line of actual control opposite Tibet, um, trying to rebuild our air force, even though that is not going very fast. Building the navy, all of these, of course, face difficulties, but that is all internal balance. So all of these are now being done with China folks, as opposed to earlier cases where we were doing all of this with Pakistan. Right? I mean, so we are in that respect engaging in internal balancing. External balancing, of course, we are doing that with both the United States as well as other major Asian powers. U.S.-India relations is unrecognizable now compared to even 15 years or 10 years back. We not only have arms transfers, we have signed a number of foundational agreements, Comcasa, SISMO, Limova, all of these agreements that are signed. We now have, logistics agreements so that US forces can come here, we can use their bases and things like that. And of course, we have a very active diplomatic relationship with the United States also. Similarly, with a lot of other major Asian powers, with Japan and Australia, these are countries that we had traditionally been very cool towards. We didn't have bad relations with them, but we didn't have good relations with them. We saw them as essentially lackeys of the United States, and so we didn't really have too close a relationship. But over the last decade, especially, more than that, but especially over the last decade, our relations with these countries have dramatically improved. Japan, particularly so. What special strategic and global partnership, they keep coming up with all kinds of different terms for this, but definitely significant sort of relationship with Japan. Australia is also still dramatic, even though less so, but still dramatic, including the removing the uranium sales ban, military exercises, and of course last year we invited them to the Malabar exercise after a long time. Other countries also, Vietnam, Singapore, Indonesia, with all of these countries, we have our relationship has dramatically improved over the last 10 years. All of these are now strategic partnerships. And unlike a lot of other strategic partnerships, these are actually meaningful strategic partnerships where we are engaging in military exercise, joint military exercises, and have a lot of military interaction back and forth. But all of these, and of course, the most important of this is the Quad. The quadrilateral security dialogue, which seemed dead a few years back, but now clearly is very, very active. So in a sense, you can see various components of balancing, both internal balancing as well as external balancing, taking place in the strategy. Similarly, with reassurance, I mean, so there is also a consistent effort to demonstrate to China that we are not doing all this against China. So, for example, the Quad, we rarely talk about China. I mean, maybe they do it within the Quad dialogue, but if you look at all of the public statements of Quad, do not refer to China, right? Whereas when the US and Japan meet bilaterally, they talk about China, and they publicly say we are worried about China. US and Australia, they publicly say they're talking about China. But when India and the US talk, or within the Quad, we never say China, because we kind of the Indo-Pacific and the Quad. We feel repeatedly keep saying, no, it's not directed in any country. These are all friendship and not alliances of containment, as I think Jaishankar or the Prime Minister, somebody made that. And of course, beyond that, we also have various other multilateral engagements, BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, on climate change, trade, on Asian Infrastructure Bank, all of these sort of interactions that we have with China on all of these, many of these other forums. So in a sense, so what we are trying to do is, on the one hand balancing, but also at the same time trying to reassure China. But even after Galwan, we still refuse to talk, even though the Quad has become stronger on the last 1 year. India has expressed far greater anger in the last 1 year towards China, including, of course, yesterday's press conference that Jaishankar did in Russia. But it's still, we talk about Quad in terms of humanitarian assistance, HADR, rules-based order, climate change, but we don't talk about China. We also don't talk about, India has been the head of the governing board of WHO for more than a year. Gave up, I think, last month or so. But we didn't push the investigation into the origins of COVID. Australia did, which is why Australia and China have had a lot of tips over that. We haven't raised that issue, right? We haven't raised India. So even after Galwan, we are still sort of trying to. I think we have moved a little bit more, but we're still trying to sort of trying to reassure China that this is not our strategy is not sort of counter China. So this is, I would argue that this is ultimately an unviable sort of approach. So then, if it's unviable, why does India do it? I mean, I think that's an interesting question. One preliminary answer that I have is that if you look at alliance theory basically suggests that alliances come up in response to threats. But I suppose one could also talk about relative levels of threat, right? In the sense that threats are not either or. I mean, it's not that threats either exist or threats don't exist. It is that threats either grow or are at different levels. So one way to see this is to see different responses at different levels of threat. So alliances as differential responses, right? In the sense that when the threat is low, you are likely to have a different alliance response than when the threat is high. So at the highest level of threat, your alliance response may be a full-scale military alliance, right? An explicit written military alliance treaty relationship, like the US has with Japan or NATO or things like that. But at lower levels of threat, at the lowest level of threat, maybe non-alignment is one response. That you don't face any threats and therefore you engage in non-alignment. Or in between those two ends of the spectrum, maybe you have evasive balancing, which is that there is some level of threat, but the threat is not serious enough for you to fully move towards balance, and therefore there is a balancing component and there is a reassurance component, which is what I would characterize as evasive balance. Let me stop here. I'm happy to take questions or comments. I'm continuing to work on this, so I look forward to your inputs. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. That was an excellent exposition of taking us through what exactly you meant. I think now um, we have some time for the Q&A. Please raise your hand. Those of you who want to ask questions. And Professor Rajesh, do you want to take a set of questions or you want to go one by one?
Let us start with one by one, and then we can sort of, if it, then we can later we can go to grouping.
Okay, Mr. Shashank, please go ahead.
Yes, sir. Do you agree India's strategy for Indo-Pacific needs to recognize the importance of the continent of Africa?
I think ultimately, yeah, we do recognize that because not the full continent. I mean, like I said, the Indo-Pacific strategy begins in the east coast of Africa, primarily because we see the Indo-Pacific as including the Indian Ocean. Right? I mean, so for Japan, Australia, the United States, other partners, three key partners, um, the Indo-Pacific is primarily still about the Pacific because China doesn't have much of a presence in the Indian Ocean, and they are all in that Pacific part of the Indo-Pacific. So it's still focused for us, obviously, because we are here. Therefore, our focus is Indian Ocean, and so our definition does begin with the eastern coast. But outside of that, in terms of the content itself and politics in the content, as of now, no, we don't have. I mean, I think eventually that will come because Africa and the Middle East are regions where China will make inroads because China is far away from this threats. Both power and threats do not travel well over distance. I mean, this is something that we know from Mearsheimer and others that the farther away you are, the less of a threat you are. And so China may be seen as a threat by its neighbors, but the further you go, the less likely are countries to see China as a threat. So Middle East countries will not see China as a threat. Africa countries will not see China as a threat. And therefore, they are going to find it easier to make inroads there. And therefore, obviously, there will have to be a response. Whether it will come within the Indo-Pacific construct or some other construct, we'll have to wait and see.
Dr. Anand?
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, sir, for a very inspiring kind of a lecture. It made us basically think a lot. And I was thinking whether this particular phenomenon which you call as evasive balancing, can it be also be understood as something which is more nuanced form of a balancing in the sense, or vis-a-vis a very open, crude sort of a balancing? And if it is that, then do you feel, isn't it more effective actually because there is a certain amount of deception built into it by the use of narratives and things like that? I just have that clarification to make from. Thank you.
Sure. I agree with you. I mean, it is a more complicated form of balancing. And it includes some level of covert effort to both balance and to sort of. The problem that I see with it is not the strategy in the sense that what is the strategy supposed to achieve? Right, the strategy is supposed to make China not be a threat. Right, I mean that's the whole purpose. Right? I mean, but that will happen only if China believes what you say, and China is sort of foolish enough to fall for it, right? I mean, and so that is the key problem. That's the problem with reassurance in general, which is that if you make significant enough concessions, or rather, for them to not see you as a threat, your concessions have to be significant, right? If you don't make significant concessions, they will see this as fake, right? They will see that you're trying to fool them. Whereas you can't afford to make significant concessions because that will make you vulnerable, right? So if you think about what, for example, in the current context, what might be the concessions that will satisfy China, right? The kind of concessions that we are willing to give, which is not talk about Xinjiang or not talk about Quad as balanced against China, that is much too little for China to be satisfied, right? I mean, we have to get out of the Quad. Even getting out of the Quad might not be sufficient, right? I mean, we have to essentially quote or demonstrate that we will not be a threat by I don't know what. I mean, maybe giving into all of their claims in the in the along the LAC or whatever else. So those are not concessions. I mean, so in a sense, reassurance requires significant concessions, right? I mean, significant efforts, which in most countries will not be willing to do, and that's the problem with reassurance, right? I mean, if they are not, then if the concessions are not significant, nobody will take it seriously. But if the concessions are significant, then you make yourself vulnerable, and that is too much of a risk. Right? I mean, so we are caught in the middle. So yes, it is all of that. I agree with you, except that it won't work. And if it doesn't work, then what's the purpose, right?
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Daksh Sharma.
Hi, sir. Thank you so much for your presentation and your lecture. I have a couple of questions. The first is, you talked about the varying perceptions of the Indo-Pacific narrative. There are two which come to my mind, which is the ASEAN outlook of the Indo-Pacific, and one is the US's free and open Indo-Pacific.
Yeah.
According to your views, which one is more aligned towards India's interests? And let's say India does align, if say India aligns with the US's free and open Indo-Pacific, what are some of the costs and the burden sharing which we'll have to pay, as you mentioned in your previous answer, if we make concessions towards China? So what concessions do you feel that we'll have to make towards the United States?
Yeah. So it's not a question of concessions towards the United States per se, in the sense that it is a question of how much of a threat India perceives that it faces from China, and therefore what you do about it. Right? So it's not, it is not conceding to the United States is not really the issue, right? I mean, so what between the two, between the sort of the ASEAN concept. I mean, we are publicly, at least, we are still on the ASEAN centrality. Like that. The problem is that ASEAN over the last 10 years has, or last 5-7 years, has not really been successful in dealing with not just China, but also other problems. But we can leave out other problems like Myanmar and things like that. But definitely on the China part, look at South China Sea, not really been successful in dealing with it. So ASEAN centrality is primarily something that we say, which is as a way of, again, as a way of reassuring China that we are not going the whole hog into a military alliance relationship with the United States. Right? So, but the point is that I suppose you could see it in two ways. I mean, it depends, as I said at the end, that it depends on the level of threat. Alliances and alignments is a function of the variation of threat. If you see it in that sense, which much of alliance literature does not, but if you see alliances and alignments as spread along a spectrum, the question is not about specific concessions made to the United States, but whether the threat from China increases or decreases, right? I mean, if we sense the threat from China is increasing, for whatever reason, mistakes that we make, mistakes that they make, I'm not concerned about that. But if that goes up, then India will have no choice but to move further along that spectrum towards a formal military alliance. It doesn't have to get there, but it will move along that spectrum towards a formal military relationship. So all alliances include some loss of autonomy, right? I mean, you can't if you're allied with somebody else, to some extent, their calculations will have to be factored into your calculation, right? I mean, so you have to some autonomy in decision making will have to be given up in order when you enter a relationship. But that loss of autonomy will have to be weighed against the loss of autonomy and the loss of the national interest in not dealing with the threat, right? I mean, so these are not. It's not either or. I mean, if you have to sort of compare what the consequences of not responding to the threat are vis-a-vis the potential loss of autonomy in an alliance. So that is the calculation that we have to make. It's not that obviously an alliance relationship would involve some cost, but so would not balance, right? I mean, so both of those costs are what one would have to compare. Okay, thanks.
Sri Kutan.
Yes, sir. Thank you for the lecture. It was wonderful listening to you. Sir, I had a few questions. First
Sure.
one is from your article, India's Unviable Indo-Pacific Strategy. So in that, you have asked for like the same strategy again. I mean, evasive balancing. So my question to you is that how do you see the role of certain countries? I'll be specific. Russia, New Zealand, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Singapore. So I would also like to include Thailand because one of my friends pointed out how Christmas Canal can play a different role or can change the dynamics in the region. So the other countries you have mentioned in your article too. So how do you see the role of this country, especially Russia? And also one question regarding one of your comment, whereby you said that when the like countries not in the region won't be influenced. So I just saw a post in Twitter how like one of these professors, I often see that she is like always anti-China, but it says that 73% of New Zealanders have no confidence in Xi Jinping as a global leader. So the professor is Annie Mary Brady. So
Yeah.
yeah, so but I've seen that Jacinda Ardern has been reluctant to cite the human rights issues in Xinjiang. So how do you see that? My point is that since New Zealand, a country whose prime minister and people have taken a different stand, do you think same kind of dynamics will apply later in Africa? Because I don't know, like maybe because you get my point, right? Like
No,
it
yeah,
may.
I get. I mean, yeah. So is that the question? There's two questions, right? So,
Yes, sir.
so to take the second question first, I mean, I'm constantly, I don't know, puzzled or, I mean, I suppose it's important to get the opinions of the people on behalf of whom the foreign policy is being built or being made. But I'm not sure what the effect of popular opinion is on actual foreign policy making, right? And that's you will find that divergence in every country, right? Even in India. For example, if you look at India's foreign relations and India's public opinion, or opinion in terms of, let's say, favorability ratings towards different countries, right? US has always been much higher in terms of favorability rating, even though, obviously US-India relations have never been good, except for the last 10 years or so, right? I mean, so I'm not sure that that necessarily reflects how policies are made, right? I mean, so favorability ratings have a lot of different things that go into it, and I'm not sure that leaders in any country, whether it's authoritarian countries, democratic countries, whatever, that plays a role in how they make decisions. So yes, within New Zealand, there may be a difference between the prime minister and her party and the popular opinion, but that difference exists in India. It exists in other places. It's not peculiar. Right? So sometimes they gel, sometimes they don't. I mean, so it's not. So but I keep saying this all the time. I mean, the Pew surveys keep coming out with favorable opinions of the United States or China or somebody or the other, of Trump and Obama, and I mean, but these have to do with a lot of other things than really about foreign policy. So it's interesting, but I'm not sure that's relevant in the sense that I know a lot of people take it seriously, but I'm not sure it's really relevant in understanding foreign policy behavior of state. Right? So that's
Sir, do you think that maybe in the future Africa soon also will be like against China? I see that they have a lot of infrastructure projects and that can play a positive role, but with the debt
yeah.
trap coming in.
Yeah. So I mean, one of the things that happens is the closer you get to people, the less you like them, right? I'm sorry to be so cynical, but you don't fight with strangers, by and large, right? I mean, you fight with people that you know. I mean, so you fight with neighbors, you fight with family, right? Because you can fight with strangers, obviously, but I mean, it's most often you are likely to fight with people you know, right? The greater the familiarity, the greater the disagreements and differences and whatnot. So China, as it grows, as it expands, is likely to impinge more and more on others, just as the United States impinges on others all around the world because it is a global power, right? I mean, so the ugly American is a Cold War concept, but the idea is that Americans are disliked everywhere in the world. But that is partly the consequence of the ugly American business that Americans are seen as crass and loud and whatnot, and bad sort of publicity they have. So as China expands and Chinese go into various countries in Africa and Middle East and whatnot, and as their practices and as their behavior impinges on others, you will find the same phenomenon, right? I mean, so you will have some level of disagreement. I mean, you're already seeing that, for example, in some kind of projects that China does in Africa. A lot of problems, not just the DETRA part of it, that is one, but that's a macro level problem. But in the micro level, China also takes labor, Chinese labor, to work on the Chinese BRI projects in Africa, right? I mean, and that they have a lot of problems engaging with the local population. There's a lot of tensions there. So you would have those kinds of things happening. Now, does that mean that these countries per se would be antagonistic, would be eventually become antagonistic to China? I don't think so. I mean, what is most likely to happen in places like the Middle East and Latin America and China, in Africa and so on, is that just like what happened in the Cold War, right? Countries that are further away, like India, African countries, are likely to play one off against the other and get the best from both. And it's best for them. I mean, they benefit if they play one off against the other, and that's what is going to happen in a lot of these places, unless for whatever reason they have to, for personal reasons, something or the other, or ideological reasons, they have to get very close to one side, allied to one side. It's unlikely. Most of these countries are going to play this game, right? Which we played very effectively in the Cold War, and they're going to play one off against it. So that is going to be the greater driver, I think the more important driver of African policies towards China, which is that they will try to get as much as they can from China, but they'll also try to get as much as they can from the United States and India and the other countries that are opposing China. And so they will play one off against it, right? I mean, and so there is no escape for either the Western side or China from that game, right? There is nothing they can do about it. The US and the Soviet Union were led by their nose throughout the Cold War period by the rest of the third world, into providing them all kinds of assistance. And that's going to happen again. So that's the game. There's nothing much. If it's a bipolar world, this is going to happen, except for countries that are very close, physically, geographically close to China, which feel China as threat, and therefore they can't play that game, right? But further away you are, you can play that, right? I mean, so that is good. So that is, I think, the dynamic that's going to more likely determine how, but their relationship with China. The early question, your first question about Russia, Vietnam, and so on and so forth. Russia, I mean, Russia is in a peculiar position because it is, its GDP is half of India, right? I mean, GDP is like 1/10 of China. So yes, they have some weapons and they have some legacy technology, things like that, which make them a great power. But beyond that, they really don't have the economic capacity to do very much. So Putin is playing a very poor hand very well, right? I mean, so he's got very few cards, but he's playing them very well. But ultimately, the problem that Russia has is that their relationship with the West is worse than the relationship with China. And so that I am not sure how that will get resolved, because this ideally, obviously, Russia has a lot to fear from China. Russians still are very suspicious of China. Chinese are very suspicious of Russia. But they both, this is always a problem. There's always a bigger threat. I mean, when there's a bigger threat, even otherwise inimical countries are likely to come together, right? I mean, so it is not surprising that Russia and China are coming together because of that greater threat that they face, that both face from the West. And so it's an alliance of alignment of convenience, as all alliances are. And so that but that does create a problem for us, because our relationship is become more edgy because of that. Despite what Jaishankar might say, it's become a lot more problematic because of that. I mean, and there is I don't know whether it's possible to firewall this relationship from the Russia-China relationship, the India-China relationship. All of this becomes somewhat problematic, because we saw Lavrov last year criticizing Quad and Indo-Pacific and things like that, and Indians responded rather harshly towards that. which we don't normally do with China, with Russia. So there are problems there. I mean, part of the problem is that it's not in our control, in the sense that this is a function of Russia's relationship with the West, which we can't control, which we can't manage, which we can't mediate. There's nothing we can do about that. So we are kind of the collateral damage, as it were, of that. And so, we will have to figure, that is not, we'll have to see how it goes, because I think if that relationship, Russia and the West, the relationship continues to worsen, then ultimately it will affect us. It will hurt Russia-India relations. There's no question. Right? In terms of Vietnam, and yeah, obviously Vietnam is US aircraft carrier, I think, right now visiting Vietnam. I mean, amazing. I mean, they killed each other by the tens of thousands, and now there is a US aircraft carrier being welcomed into Vietnam. I mean, so what that shows us is that threats dominate. So its countries respond to threats more than anything else, and so that also makes us, for us, fortunately, we don't have any of those tensions, unlike the United States with Vietnam. And so we have always been supportive of Vietnam. Historically, we've been close to Vietnam going back to the 60s. In fact, we spoiled our relationship with the United States because of our criticism of US behavior in Vietnam, right? I mean, our relationship, the problem that we have, in a sense, not problem, but the issue that we have is that we don't have things that we can really do to help Vietnam, right? We are doing some training of pilots and submariners and some weapons transfers, things like that, but we are limited in that capacity. That is the primary difficulty that we have. As to what can we do to sort of help Vietnam? Beyond that, I don't think there is a big issue. What are the which other countries did you mention?
Sir, other states were Indonesia, Singapore. Singapore because Indonesia because I think US and Indonesia came into an agreement to build a base in Indonesia near the Malacca, and Thailand.
Yeah, Thailand I don't know enough about, so I will sort of leave that aside. But Indonesia, Indonesia, I was just looking at the figures yesterday for some other reason, but Indonesia spends very little, less than 1%. It's a large country, but it spends less than 1% on its defense. I mean, much lesser than Japan does in terms of percentage of GDP. So, but they have been very careful about China. But for reasons best known to Beijing, I mean, Beijing has been picking fights with them. I mean, so they are becoming much closer. I mean, so a lot of this relationship dynamic is being driven by China. Right? I mean, so all of the reasons we are getting close to all of these individual countries in Southeast Asia all have to do with China. And so Indonesia, similarly, our relations are better than they were ever before, except for the early first decade. And so, driven primarily by China, because they are getting more and more worried about China. So, in the 80s, when India was building up its navy, the Indonesians were very worried because the Andamans, they had at one point of time disputed position of the Andaman, our presence on the mouth of the Malacca Straits, and so on and so forth. But now we are cooperating with them. I mean, we are cooperating with Indonesia. We are similarly cooperating with Singapore. And Singapore does its air force, trains in India, and so all of that for them, India is one more little balancing weight against China, right? But we can't counter China on our own, but it's one more bit that can help balance the scale. Ultimately, we are not going to be able to do it alone. But so our relationships with all of these countries are limited both by our willingness and our capacity. So our willingness is also sometimes a suspect because we aren't as bad as China is in our relationships, but because they go, all the wolf warrior diplomacy and whatnot. But the fact is that we can also be very insensitive in our relationships. We don't do on the diplomatic side what we need to do in terms of reassuring them about our help. We are always on the fence when it comes to helping them, other than on civilian, humanitarian, things like that. The other part is, of course, our capacity. Everybody knows that our capacity is not that great. not like the United States. And so, but both you need both willingness and capacity. And capacity, we definitely don't have enough of, and willingness, they are still uncertain about, and they constantly complain about. Right? I mean, South Asian countries constantly complain about. So that's a key issue there.
Thank you.
Gokul.
Good evening, sir. I have a few questions. There have been reports of China improving their air bases and deploying Tibetans as soldiers while the talks are stalled. So, what is the future, or what is the future feasibility of continuing such talks? And also, is China going in a time-buying strategy by delaying the talks for an imminent attack or aggression? Sir.
Yeah. That's a tough question. I obviously don't really know. I mean, because Chinese calculations are enormously difficult to interpret from the outside. I mean, I'm not a Chinologist. I don't really know, but it's also very, very difficult to figure out what China is up to, right? I mean, a lot of the stuff that they say, a lot of stuff that they do makes neither strategic nor tactical sense, right? I mean, tactical sense in the sense that they don't get what they want. They entered into a spat with Sweden, into a spat with Norway for the Nobel Prize. They entered a spat with New Zealand, with Canada. I mean, these are not countries that people normally fight with. Right? These are not countries that are known for getting into these kinds of fights. And they don't get what they want. I mean, they didn't want a Nobel Prize for one of their dissidents. They didn't get that. They wanted South Korea not to deploy the THAAD missiles. They didn't get that. So they don't get, tactically speaking, they don't get what they want immediately, the specific reason for why they were doing that. And strategically, it's foolish because they are creating the balancing coalition against themselves because of their behavior, which is foolish, right? So both tactically and strategically, they are engaging in behavior that is extremely foolish. The problem is that it seems so foolish that we don't know why they're doing what they do, right? I mean, it's very difficult from the outside to explain. So it's kind of a roundabout way of saying that what they're doing in the border is also equally difficult to explain. Why did they do what they did last year in Ladakh? I mean, forget Galwan. Galwan, it's just forces are close by, they get into blows, that is accidental, let's say. But the original deployment of forces, which is very, very deliberate, it's very clearly deliberate, right? Because they used their military exercises, they hid up behind a military exercise to deploy their military. That is deliberate. And why would you do that? Why would you do that when India was, prior to that, demonstrating some reticence about joining the Quad or deepening the Quad or balancing each channel? I mean, you are, it's difficult to understand why China did that, right? I mean, so would they engage in an actual military, is the delay because they are preparing for an actual attack? There are lots of peculiarities there, right? I mean, in the sense that they're constantly changing. That this is the third commander that they were deployed in the Western Theater, right? I mean, so that's also very peculiar. I'm sure you saw the news reports the last couple of days where they replaced the Western Theater commander who has been in command only for 7 months. It's very, very unusual for China. So are they preparing for something? Is it that they have? Are they getting somebody in there who's more willing to do what Beijing wants, or is it that these other commanders, earlier commanders, were telling them that we can't go to war with China, with India, because Indian defense are too strong, or what? We don't know. I mean, it's difficult to say what they are planning or what their calculation is. But their high levels of nationalism also makes it possible. It is possible that they might engage. What are the key constraints that China faces? That they have had no recent combat experience. The most recent is of course 79 with Vietnam, and they lost that badly, right? I mean, so I mean, they got bloodied by the Vietnam. So that is something that they worry about. We know they worry about it. that is one of the things that preventing them from maybe going into or invading Taiwan, let's say, because that would also be a very difficult operation. So would they see an operation across the LAC as maybe a way of testing out their forces? Is that possible? Or would they pick a lighter target, a less serious target than India? Because India is not that. India, if it was a surprise, if it was done by surprise, then it could have been done. But now that Indian forces are fully mobilized, it's going to be a bit difficult. I mean, their air power in that area is somewhat weaker for topographical reasons. So, I mean, if they do go to war, India's fully alert. This is not the best time for them to go to war. But then again, they have done all kinds of stupid things, so we don't know. And so I don't. I mean, sorry. I mean, I'm kind of roundabout way of saying I don't really know. I mean, it's very difficult to interpret what they do. Okay.
Ms. Madhuvanti.
Good evening, sir. Thank you for the insightful lecture. Sir, my question was regarding recently China increasing their number of nuclear silos. So how it will impact this region and will it fuel an arms race in this region? Sir?
Yeah, I was just writing a short piece on that. But yeah, you had a recent piece in the print by Kunal Singh, I think a few days back, saying that there is a dynamic there, which is that China reaching up to match US's or somewhere close to US's capabilities, or at least trying to prevent the US having too much of a superiority, because the US has too great a superiority. Then there are temptations of a first strike, a counter first strike. I don't think that this is a lot of this nuclear deterrence literature is just fantasizing by a lot of scholars and analysts. I don't think that political leaders think in those terms when they're talking about nuclear. I mean, in conventional war, maybe people can fool themselves, but not with nuclear, right? So the idea, at least in Kunal's piece, was that as China sort of tries to reduce its vulnerability to vis-a-vis the US by increasing its forces, then that puts that makes Indian forces more vulnerable, Indian nuclear force more vulnerable. And so that requires some watching as to what they're up to. My sense is that there is a possibility that China is trying to match up to the United States, or at least reduce the vulnerability. But we don't exactly, again, this goes back to the last question, we don't exactly know what they're doing, because the silos that they built, and if you see a lot of the commentary about those silos, the silos they built are very, there are better ways of building silos, right? In the sense that the fire silos are too close to each other, which basically means that you could potentially use a large enough warhead to take out two silos with one strike. Now, nobody will do that if there is two separate silos. You would potentially use four warheads for two aim points. But the problem is that they could have built these silos a little bit further apart, right? I mean, so that would have made the problem even worse for the United States. So we don't know what they're building the silos for. I mean, one possibility that I was thinking about was that it could be that they are increasing the number of aim points for US targets, right? So they have very few nuclear warheads. China has very few nuclear warheads relative to the United States, especially when you look at the ICBM count. And so they want, and they're hiding it. They kind of their strategy is to keep it, prevent the US from destroying all of it in its first strike, so that they can retaliate. But then one of the ways of doing that, so far they've been doing that by hiding this. But another way to do that is by giving the US a lot of targets to hit, right? I mean, so if you create lots of targets all over the country, US doesn't know which of these silos have missiles and which they should hit, and they can't afford not to hit these silos, right? Because maybe there is something there, right? Maybe there is a missile there. So if you have only very few warheads, if you have only very few missiles, and your potential adversary has 10 times as many, then one way to not increase your, and you don't want to increase your arsenal by a large number. Another way to deal with that adversary is by increasing the aim points that the adversary will have to aim at, right? I mean, you create you have only 100 missiles, but you create 1,000 targets for the enemy. So the enemy doesn't know where within this 1,000 targets is 100 missiles are hiding. They can't afford to ignore any of them because the one they ignore may be the one that has a missile, right? So by creating more aim points, they reduce the significance of the numerical difference between themselves and the United States. So the US may have more warheads or more missiles, but they also have more targets to hit. Right? So it seems to me to be a simple way that China does not want to increase the number of warheads, which which they don't seem to want. But then again, it's also possible that Xi Jinping thinks that for the US, for China to be a bipolar power on equal footing with the United States, it has to have 1,000, it has to have 1,500 or whatever the number of missiles that the United States has. That's also equally possible, right? I mean, so we don't know. It will take time to figure that out. My initial sense is that they're doing the first thing, which is basically they're trying to increase the aim points to confuse the United States. But even if they were increasing the number of actual number of warheads instead of just silos, it still wouldn't require us to change our strategy as far as I can sort of see. Therefore, I would sort of disagree with Kunal. Our strategy, like the Chinese strategy, at least until now, has been based on uncertainty. That is, no adversary can be sure that they can destroy our entire nuclear force in one strike. And therefore, if they can't destroy all of our nuclear force in one strike, then they will suffer some consequence for their attacking us. And when the consequences are nuclear consequences, then that's pretty serious consequence. That's what our difference is based on. Knowing that it's assured retaliation, that we will retaliate. You can be assured of our retaliation, right? Which means that they will have to suffer the consequence of a nuclear attack. That is the base of our defense. And so, irrespective of how many nuclear warheads China has or how many missiles China has, that doesn't change. China can, even if they have 10 times as many weapons as we have, they cannot be sure that they can destroy all of our weapons. And so that will still hold. My sense is that will still hold them, deter them from attack. I mean, we need to only have one weapon that survives, that can take out Beijing or Shanghai or or somewhere along a dirty bomb somewhere along the Yellow Sea or wherever. I mean, any number of things that we can do that will create, even with one weapon, create such destruction in China that any victory over India would be worthless, right? So that's my sense of it.
Mr. Srikutan, you had another question. Do you want to pose it before we close?
If it's okay with you, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. So, I would like to add one point earlier that I had in my mind earlier. So, how do you think evasive balancing is happening with Modi wishing Dalai Lama for his birthday? You see any change?
Yeah. So that's the problem. No, I mean, so you do this on the one hand, you do something else on the other. So that is exactly what we are trying to sort of, if you are sitting in Beijing, even if you are not as inscrutable as Chinese strategic decision making is, if you're sitting in Beijing as a normal analyst, if you think of yourself, put yourself in Beijing. So what are you supposed to make of it, right? On the one hand, you're doing this. On the other hand, you are want to do things with breaks, and you're trying to have negotiations. So it's all very confusing, right? I mean, so are you a friend? Are you an enemy? So it becomes very difficult to figure out from their perspective, right? I mean, so I think they have a much simpler attitude, which is that India is a big country. India is potentially a great power, which means that it doesn't matter what they do. I mean, we will balance against them in any case. And so they have been exercising that balancing strategy against India for a long time, going back to the 60s, right? Going back to their Iron Brother, going back to the axis, China-Pakistan axis that has been, So that has been their constant strategy. So they figured, okay, we don't want to try to figure out what Indians are up to. We will simply focus on the capabilities. They're capable of being a great power. They're capable of being a threat, and therefore that's what we'll focus on. Right? I mean, that seems to be their approach. sort of looking at every time we sort of shift from one foot to the other, trying to figure out what we are trying to do. They kind of have that mind made. It seems to me. Okay.
Thank you, sir. It's a pleasure listening to you. Thanks.
Thanks.
Okay, if there are no further questions, I would now request our PhD scholar, Mr. Uday Patil, to propose a vote of thanks.
Good evening, everyone. I am Uday Patil and I am pleased to deliver the vote of thanks. First of all, on behalf of the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations, MAHE, I thank Professor Rajesh Rajagopalan for taking time out from his busy schedule and speaking to us today on the pertinent theme, India's evasive balancing in the Indo-Pacific, a realist perspective. His lecture has indeed provided us some fascinating insights on this very topical theme. Sir, I can say on behalf of everyone that we stand much enlightened on the subject than we were before listening to you. Let me also take this opportunity to thank Dr. Nanda Kishore, Associate Professor and Head of our DJIR family. He has always made efforts to invite distinguished guests for the lectures and provide us exposure to a wide range of issues and perspectives. Thank you so much, sir. My special thanks to Dr. Anand V for making the poster of the lecture and coordinating this event. He has been always on the forefront whenever the department organizes such distinguished lectures. I would also like to thank all the faculty members of the department for their cooperation as well as efforts for this lecture to succeed. A number of students from various universities and many experts from the field of IR and strategic studies had also joined the lecture. I want to convey my gratitude to them. And last but not the least, I thank all the students of the department for their enthusiastic response and active participation. The students of GIR have always shown their passion whenever they find such learning opportunity. Once again, thank you everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Uday. Thank you, Professor Rajesh, for having taken time out to interact with us. We'll continue to do this and we'll have many more interactions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Good day
Thank
to
you.
all of you. Take care.